Hello everyone, Professor Philip Travis. This week in our history of modern Russia, this is our final week. And so this week we're going to be thinking about Russia since the end of the Cold War. Russia, not only during the Putin era, which of course we will focus a reasonable amount on, but also Russia in the aftermath of the demise of the Soviet Union, which occurred officially on December 31st, 1991. I hope everyone's enjoyed this course. It's been a really fun course for me. I'm really excited about reading all of your essays. Don't forget, we have our final exam and we have our major essay coming up. Those are due, of course, during exam week. I'm excited about those exams, the essays on the exams, and I'm particularly excited to read your research essays. Remember, when you're doing those essays, be sure to follow the checklist. I put a checklist up for everyone. Make sure when you talk about the length of the paper, I refer to the length of the paper as pages, but particularly this is measured on the basis of full pages of text. So headers, half of the page being off at the end will not count for a full page count. So make sure you fulfill basic requirements. Remember to cite in Chicago style. Remember to have an introduction that has a narrative hook paragraph as well as an argument paragraph, a thesis paragraph. So I hope everyone's really enjoyed this class, and I hope to see you, many of you, in classes of mine in the future. So be on the lookout for my future offerings in upcoming terms, as I'd be very excited to have you in my class, in my future classes. So the announcement this week, I'll try to not make this too long. I want to talk a little bit about the Russian war in Ukraine and its sort of historical roots. And I want to talk a little bit about one of the more common sort of themes that is sort of tossed around in discussions about this. And this relates to the end of the Cold War, the expansion of NATO, and how we should think about the expansion of NATO as it relates to the development of the Russian war in Ukraine. So, first of all, a little background on Ukraine becoming an independent country. Of course, in this class, we've talked quite a lot about sort of the struggles for independence in Ukraine, the experience of Russian control and imperialism in Ukraine. But the modern independence of Ukraine, of course, comes with the demise of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union officially met its demise December 31st, 1991, after Gorbachev left power, being replaced in Russia by Boris Yeltsin. Not long before that, of course, Ukraine had a referendum in 1991 and voted for independence. And Ukraine's vote for independence, in a lot of respects, it sowed the demise, you might argue, for the Soviet Union. Gorbachev had proposed something in the way of like a loose union of sovereign states to replace the old Soviet system. But Ukraine refused to join that. They voted for independence, and subsequently numerous other states would take similar steps in voting for their independence. So Ukraine's independence in a lot of ways was a critical moment in the independence of other Soviet republics and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, here you see two maps. Of course, over here, this is the Soviet Union and then the United States, the Warsaw Pact, I should say, the Warsaw Pact and NATO. The Soviet Union, its allies, the United States, its allies during the early Cold War era. And you can see different shadings refer to changes in the statehood of, like, for example, the admittance of Turkey, for example, which was not initially involved in NATO. And, of course, over here you see NATO today. And, of course, today we know that Finland and Sweden may be joining NATO. But today NATO has expanded significantly. And this is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which, of course, was created in 1949, largely because of a concern about further expansion of Soviet influence. And the Warsaw Pact was, of course, the Soviet Union's response to this, forming its own sort of military alliance that would oppose the potential threats of the West. So, kind of reiterating that, reasons for NATO and also reasons for the Warsaw Pact were linked inherently to World War II. NATO was, of course, created to contain Soviet communism in Europe so that European countries and the United States and their allies could align together and ensure collective defense against the possibility of a war with the Soviet Union. And these, of course, were linked to what you might call the lessons of Munich, which for the United States, and this, of course, this photo that you see here is, of course, a photo from the Munich conference. Of course, that conference infamously, when Germany, Adolf Hitler leading Nazi Germany, placed demands on the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia, threatening war, and, of course, Neville Chamberlain, who is right here, of course, infamously bargained with Hitler, gave up the Sudetenland without even allowing the Czechoslovakians to be in the room and to debate the matter, giving away this part of Czechoslovakia just prior to, of course, the onslaught of World War II, in which Nazi Germany would subsequently take the rest of Czechoslovakia, invade Poland, and effectively, for a period of time, militarily conquer most of Europe. So the lesson for the United States, as well as its Western allies from World War II, was don't appease a potential aggressor. Don't make the mistake of being an isolationist power. Don't make this mistake of appeasing a potentially aggressive foreign power. That you had to be engaged internationally, you had to be prepared internationally, and you had to be ready to contain the potentiality of an expansionist, aggressive, authoritarian threat to sovereign states. This is really why NATO was created, to act, to oppose that by collective security and embracing the sovereignty of member states. Interestingly, of course, the Soviet Union, as we've learned in our class, I think, was also had its own lessons of the West, and its lessons of lessons of Munich, and its lessons of Munich were be suspicious of the intentions of the West. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, of course, there was a great deal of suspicion between Nazi Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union. But nonetheless, this was another sort of piece of evidence for Soviet leaders that the West's goal was to break apart the Soviet Union, to open it up to influence by Western capitalist enterprises. And of course, that went right back to the beginning stages of Lenin in the early Soviet state. So their lessons of World War II was don't trust the West, because if they have the opportunity, they will do what Nazi Germany did. They will attack the Soviet Union. And so these are really, collectively, these are really the reasons together why the United States formed NATO, and likewise why the Soviet Union, in response, formed the Warsaw Pact. Both are effectively suspicious about the designs of the other on areas of spheres of influence, their areas of influence. And it's also important to note that as you look at the modern map of NATO here, it's important to know the Cold War was unique because you had a very real divide between the world of Soviet communism and its allies and the world of U.S. democratic capitalism and its allies. So this was a period of time that might be called an era of bipolarity. That's what makes it sort of unique. The world was divided between two sort of competing spheres of influence who did not engage in, like, normalized movements of people, of normalized trade, economic relations. Even normalized diplomacy took some time before that even developed, particularly and mostly during the period of détente. Of course, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the NATO powers remained in place. NATO remained, and of course, it's very logical to understand why former Soviet states, like the Baltic countries, for example, like Poland, would want to be part of NATO, because they are inherently vulnerable to the Soviet Union, or Russia, I apologize, Russia. They're inherently vulnerable to Russia. And of course, if history is any lesson for them, they have reason to, be distrustful of Russia. And there's a legacy, obviously, of Russia seeking to control and imperialize their sovereign rights. And of course, we read specifically about cases up here in the Baltic states, where you had people deported during the Sovietization of these states, which occurred following the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact at the beginning of World War II between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. So the alliance remains. The United States enters into a moment that it calls, we historians would call the unipolar moment. For a brief period of time, maybe a decade or so, the United States was the Central World superpower. And it seemed like its hegemonic influence in the world would be relatively unrivaled. So the alliance remains in place. It expands in really two major expansions to include the former Warsaw Pact states, and it also included, ultimately, the authorization of the creation of a missile defense shield in Poland, which was considered very provocative from the Russian standpoint. In Bucharest in 2008, the possibility of adding both Ukraine and Georgia was brought up. It was denied. Georgia, of course, you can't see it, but it's down in the Caucasus Mountains if you were to go towards where Stalingrad was if you were to go to the east of the Black Sea and go down, you would be in the Caucasus regions, and you would find countries like Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, north of Iran. Well, Georgia and Ukraine in 2008 were seeking membership to NATO. They were denied. Russia viewed these developments as inherently threatening, particularly after the development of the rise of Vladimir Putin, and things like the missile defense shield in Poland, the overtures of places like Ukraine and Georgia. These were considered to be a potential threat by Putin and Russia. The Ukrainian Revolution, of course, of 2014 increasingly moved Ukraine into a Western European-focused mentality. Still not giving up on NATO membership, still hopeful of maybe EU membership. And this, of course, resulted in Russia annexing the Crimean Peninsula, of course, which is right here, as well as supporting separatists in the region of the Donbass, Luhansk and Donetsk, which are located here, as I'm sure we're all very aware of this now. So we look at that, and I'm sure we're all aware of this, and so when you look at that, is the war in Ukraine NATO's fault somehow? There's some real problems with blaming NATO for the Ukraine war. First of all, a problem with blaming NATO for the war is, of course, it reduces responsibility for the actual actor initiating the war, which is, of course, Vladimir Putin-led Russia. The war in Ukraine is what you might call a preventative war. And that doesn't sound like a bad term, but it is when it comes to international law and foreign relations. A preventative war is like the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, for example. This is a case of a war where one country basically seeks to use their military as a way to achieve a sort of foreign policy objective, using the military, using war for self-interested sort of purposes. And so the violation of Ukrainian sovereignty, this is a very clear violation of accepted norms of international law. It's a violation of the sovereign rights of Ukraine. And it's an example, it's not a preemptive war, because preemptive war means that a country took initiative and attacked the other because an attack was inevitable, that an attack was in place, underway, and so the action was taken to preempt that attack. A preventative war is different. This is where an attack on the other is not inevitable, but a major power takes the military action against the other country as a way to achieve certain geopolitical objectives. Another reason why you really shouldn't give NATO the primary blame for the war in Ukraine, the expansion of NATO, that is because the 1990s, when much of the expansion of NATO into those former Warsaw Pact states occurred, not all of it, but much of it, was during what, again, we call in international relations terms the unipolar moment. At this time period, the United States viewed itself as really the singular global hegemon, and Russia was not actually important. It wasn't regarded as a threat. Russia was trying to become a democracy, albeit it was a rather fledgling democracy under the less than stellar leadership of Boris Yeltsin. So Russia their economy was not strong. They were trying to become a democracy, and at the time, there was really no reason for many American and Western policymakers to not believe that Russia would just ultimately become just another player in the grand scheme of a world really dominated by U.S. hegemony. And, of course, NATO has never attacked another. We know, of course, it's a defensive alliance. And, of course, we can see why Putin might find it threatening. But we should hesitate to blame NATO for the war, obviously, to use that to justify too much sympathy for Vladimir Putin's foreign policy in this respect. Now, Putin's perspective and policy approach, a little background here, and I'm almost done. This will be the last slide. But when you think about Putin's perspective, and this is kind of a bit of the other side of this, so we talked about those lessons of Munich. It's important to note that foreign policy specialists have historically been pretty widely in agreement that Putin is not trying to do what sort of Nazi Germany did in World War II. And of course, at this point, really, it doesn't look like Russia has the military capabilities to do that, at least in a conventional sense anyway. But up to this point, Putin's really more of an opportunist as opposed to a Nazi Germany type situation where you had, of course, Hitler, who had this grand design on conflict and creating a continental, empire. Putin is more of an opportunist, probably not seeking to create a brand new USSR in its entire form, but trying to reclaim certain key areas of it as much as he could. And so the goal with Ukraine is probably to seek for Russia is to ultimately, not probably, the goal with Ukraine is to change the Ukrainian government, maintain these quote independent states in Donbass. But it is true Putin has seen westernization of European powers as an inherent threat. And he has sought to use and act in an opportunistic fashion to reclaim certain areas of the former Soviet Empire when possible. And examples of this, the Chechen War in the early 2000s. In 2008, of course, there was a breakaway region in the country of Georgia. This is where, of course, Stalin was from. Not that particular region, but the country of Georgia. He's from Gori, the city in Georgia. South Ossetia was a breakaway part of Georgia. And a war ensued, and Russia intervened in this and was successful in that intervention. Of course, after 2014, the annexation of Crimea, which was done really without any great penalty. There were some sanctions, but the Western world was well on its way to sort of accepting that Crimea was going to be a part of Russia, it appeared, along with those breakaway regions in Donbass. There's been widespread use of cyber warfare in elections, in political assassinations that have occurred in other sovereign territories. And so these are all examples of ways that Putin has sought to reassert Russian influence in areas and sort of get away with it. Belarus is basically I wouldn't go so far to say a puppet state, but very close to that. It's a country that is uniquely and only aligned really closely with Russia. And that's kind of, I think Belarus is a model for what Putin would like to see happen in Ukraine ultimately. So this is some of the background on this conflict. how should we think about this conflict? There's a long history of Russian imperialism in Ukraine. Certainly, many in Ukraine would share that, though, of course, Ukraine has many Russian peoples within it. And, of course, Ukraine played a fundamental role in the history of the Soviet Union, as well as in the history of the Russian Tsardom before it. We noted that there were Soviet leaders who came from Ukraine. Of course, major incidents like the Chernobyl incident occurred in Ukraine. Ukraine was a vital, critical part of the Soviet Union. And, of course, that legacy certainly is connected to attempts by Vladimir Putin to sort of reestablish influence in these areas, to expand the influence of Russia, of the Russian state. And, of course, he uses the justification of the threat of the West to do this. Though it should be noted, and the last thing I will say, that actually it is Russia that acknowledged Ukraine's sovereignty. It wasn't Vladimir Putin per se, but not long after Ukraine's independence, there was an agreement. It's called the Budapest Accords. And in this agreement, Ukraine agreed to give up all of its nuclear arsenal because, of course, it had nuclear weapons that it really couldn't maintain, but it had nuclear weapons in its state as a result of the period of time being part of the Soviet Union. And it agreed to give those up in exchange for Russian recognition of the independence of Ukraine. And so this was recognized during the time of Boris Yeltsin. And so this is a little bit of the background of where this war really comes from. Now, if you're in my class, just kind of summarize what you think are some of the key points to this as we start thinking about Russia in the post-Cold War period. If you're not in my class and you're on YouTube or anybody's on YouTube, subscribe to my channel if you're looking for more history lessons such as this. And again, I hope everyone's had a great term in the course, and I look forward to seeing you in a course of mine in the future. I'm sorry that this was a little long, by the way. I'll give us a few extra bonus points on that.